We've been talking about this issue of suffering for the last several lessons now, and we started off by identifying that suffering comes about because of the fact of the fall of Adam and Eve, and when they fell, it took creation from this position of being good into a place to where it became imperfect and it was flawed. Adam and Eve were flawed, and all of their descendants, of course, are flawed as well. And so, because we live in an imperfect world, an imperfect universe, suffering occurs. There are types of sufferings that just happen because that's the nature of life. That's the nature of the universe. Storms happen because storms happen. Sometimes it's not anyone's fault or anything along those lines. It just is the reality of what is. The second form of suffering we noted was self-inflicted suffering. It is when we make choices and bad decisions that impact ourselves in a negative way. This can come about through the idea of the law of sowing and reaping, which says that you always reap what you sow, but you reap more and longer than what you sowed. Or this can come about because we have negative character aspects that God is seeking to purge from our lives. And so he disciplines us with the purpose of purging those out and building in good, strong characteristics within us. The fourth form of suffering that we talked about was this injustice. It's when someone else takes actions and makes decisions that impact negatively on us. This is an issue of free will. We like our free will when we're the ones who are choosing. We're the ones who are deciding what we want to do. We dislike free will when someone else, when they utilize their free will in such a way that it negatively impacts us. And so this can come about by accident. A person can accidentally do something, can take action. They don't have any intention to hurt someone, but they hurt someone. This can happen by intention, that they're directly trying to hurt an individual, that they're directly trying to hurt someone that they have an animosity towards. This can be an aspect of just general action, direct action, which I mean this issue of persecution. Persecution is not always directed towards an individual, but individuals are impacted by it because it's directed at the group, because of the hatred of Jesus Christ. And I would encourage you, if you're wanting to know how to deal with those, with that type of injustice, what do you do about it? How do you deal with it? Well, the answers are in there, and I'm not going to take the time in this lesson to go back and explain. But in this lesson, this is the upside when it comes to the issue of suffering. And you might be sitting there listening to this and thinking, well, what sort of an upside is there? That seems kind of oxymoronic, but it is true. There is an upside to suffering. In the Jewish tradition during the time of Jesus, they had this idea that all suffering happened because of some ill that a person did, because someone made a mistake, someone did something wrong, maybe their parents did something wrong, and so as a result, the next generation dealt with this suffering because of that. And that was a very common belief. There's still groups and people who think and teach that today, that all suffering comes about for that reason. But we find out that that's not always the case. In John chapter 9, there's just a fascinating story about the time during Jesus' ministry, about one particular person that he healed. And of course, there's a lot of stories about people that Jesus healed. But in this particular one, of course, Jesus is traveling around doing like he always does. And he comes upon a person. In John chapter 9, beginning in verse 1, it says, As he passed by, that being Jesus, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? So this is that Jewish tradition that all suffering comes about because someone sinned, because either he sinned or his parents sinned, therefore he was born blind. But Jesus answered in verse 3, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. So Jesus comes back and he says, listen, you misunderstand this whole issue of suffering. You misunderstand the whole nature of it. It's not about sin. Suffering is not always about sin. See, while everyone endures suffering, God can and does use our suffering for a greater purpose. In this particular case, Jesus says, it's not this person's sin, and it's not his parents' sin. None of them did anything wrong that resulted in him warranting this blindness. Rather, there is another reason behind his suffering. And in this case, it's that the works of God might be displayed. And God, what he's saying is God not only allows suffering to happen, obviously God allows suffering to happen, but he actually brings suffering into our lives for various reasons. And by the end of this lesson, you're going to understand some of the reasoning behind it and why suffering is not a negative. It's actually ultimately a valuable aspect for us. But God literally brings suffering into our lives for various reasons. Now, those reasons, they may benefit us personally. My suffering may, in the long run, benefit me. My suffering may benefit God. By what I mean by that is what Jesus says here, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. In other words, what Jesus is saying is his suffering has a purpose that will bring honor and glory to God. Or our suffering can bring benefit to another person. Sometimes our suffering, what we go through personally, can actually result in us being able to be a benefit and being a help and being a support to other people as well. Or it can be a combination of them, of all three. It generally is. Usually when we deal with suffering, when you get down to the full extent of the purposes of suffering, it does, in fact, combine one or more, or combine two or all three of these aspects into it. So in the rest of this story, Jesus, he kneels down and basically he makes a little mud pie and puts it on the guy's eye, and he tells him to go to this particular pool close by and to wash his eyes, wash the mud off his eyes. And so the man gets up and he does what he's told. And once he washes the mud off his eyes, he can suddenly see, and people start noticing him as he's rejoicing, as he's celebrating, because of course, why wouldn't he? Just was given his eyesight back. And people start asking, well, is this that same, isn't that beggar over there? No, it can't be, because that beggar was blind from birth. This guy can obviously see. No, I'm telling you, that's him. And so people ask him what happened. He said, well, listen, I was doing what I always do. I was sitting on the side of the road begging and seeking help, and Jesus comes by, and he made this mud, and he put it on my eyes and told me to come down and wash, and when I did, I could see. And so word gets around to the Pharisees, and the Pharisees, just kind of they were the religious conservatives of their day, very often legalistic in their approach, but they were very, very influential, very powerful, very, very powerful, not just in the religious ideas, but even in the political and social scenes within the Jewish culture. And they hear about it, and they go and they bring this guy in front of them, and they ask him, they say, okay, tell us what happened. And so he tells them what happened. And they start berating him because what he's saying is promoting Jesus, and they don't like Jesus. Jesus they see as a threat to them. And so they call in the guy's parents to verify his story. They call in his parents. They say, "Is this your son? And has he been blind from birth? And how is it that he can now see?" And the parents say, "Well, yes, this is our son. We can verify that he is our son. Yes, he was born blind. How he can see, well, we weren't there, but he's a grown up. Ask him." And so they ask him again, and the man begins to tell him, says, "Listen, I already told you this. You asked me this before." And there was this threat in that the Pharisees had put out because they didn't like Jesus, because they saw Jesus as a threat to their own personal power and authority. There was this threat that they had established, that anyone who goes around and professes Jesus would basically be kicked out of the synagogue, that they wouldn't be permitted in. If you want to understand what that means, it's kind of like when we talk today in our world today about cancel culture, where a person is basically canceled. They lose all, the social media platforms completely ban them and block them all communication. They may lose their jobs, whatnot. It was essentially that level of action that would be taken against anyone who claimed to be a disciple of Jesus. And they asked him, they asked this guy, they say, "Well, are you a disciple of Jesus?" And they're asking why is it that you're, what happened? And he says, "Well, I've already explained it to you. Are you asking me again because you want to be Jesus' disciples?" And of course that gets them mad and angry because they don't like Jesus, and they say, "Well, no, we're disciples of Moses, not of Jesus." And they say, "We think that you're a disciple of Jesus." And the guy says, "Listen, I was blind, now I can see. It was Jesus who did this. Is there any other explanation? Has anyone ever seen this in history? And how could a person do this without having been sent by God?" And so the Pharisees kick him out. They don't allow him. He's basically canceled for all intents and purposes. And that brings us to verse 35 in John chapter 9. It says, "And Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and having found him, said, 'Do you believe in the Son of Man?'" Now, prior to this guy had heard of Jesus. He didn't really know. In fact, when he was asked about Jesus, when the Pharisees had asked him about Jesus, he said that he thought that Jesus was a prophet. But verse 36 says, "And he answered, 'Who is he, sir, that I might believe in him?'" In other words, he comes back, he says, okay, Jesus asked him, he says, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" This is a messianic title. And the guy says, "Well, if you're going to tell me who it is, you just tell me, Jesus, because I've already seen what you can do. You tell me who the Son of Man is, and I will absolutely believe because of what you've done." And Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you." And he said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshipped him. So in other words, basically what you have is the healing of this man, the suffering of this man in his life, and this sudden miraculous work of God in his life brought this man to a point to where he was willing to put his faith and his trust in Jesus Christ, and at the same time to go out and to serve as a witness, to serve as testimony to the saving power of Christ. That's how it benefited in this case. And so in general, there is this question of how does suffering really benefit? This is one instance in which it benefited, and we can see specifically how it became a benefit in this case. But what about other cases? What about your case? What about your individual situation? In Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 11, we looked at this in one of the previous lessons, saw this verse, but I want to draw your attention back to it. It says, "For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it." So the writer of Hebrews is saying, listen, when you're going through suffering, when you're going through a time of suffering, it can be very, very painful. And it's not pleasant, and you don't see any way that this can be, used as a benefit. But later on, after you've been through it, then you begin to see that it yields this righteousness. It yields fruit. It yields all sorts of benefits to you. And sometimes those can be seen days or weeks or months or years. Sometimes it may take all of or it may take until you get to heaven before you can see the true benefit of that suffering. But it does benefit. Why? Because it causes us to grow. You see, we are designed, as human beings, we are designed to need adversity in order to grow. How we grow, both physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, we grow by going through challenges and even suffering. Think about it like this. If a person wants to get stronger, what do they have to do? If a person wants to physically grow stronger, they have to exercise. They have to work those muscles. And that can be a very, very painful process. You know what's not painful? Sitting on the couch and eating Doritos. That's not painful. Not in the moment. But the exercise, the weight training, all of these things, that can be painful. But over time, it yields fruit. It produces strength. It grows a person physically. Mentally, we grow the same way. It's through adversity. Emotionally, we learn how to emotionally deal with problems by going through problems. Something a lot of times parents don't fully get is trying to prevent bad things from happening in the life of your child does not necessarily help your child. For your child to learn how to deal with adversity in life, and mentally and emotionally, they have to go through hard times. And even spiritually. You see, going through hard times, going through adversity and suffering spiritually, it causes us and will lead us to become more Christ-like. See, you cannot increase your faith without being forced to trust in God. You can't know peace. You cannot understand what peace really means until you go through the storms of life. You can't understand what joy is without sorrow. You think about David, King David, who was one of the greatest kings that Israel ever had. Why was David such a great king? What made him a great king? David learned how to be a king. David learned how to be a ruler. David learned how to be a wise leader by being the shepherd and being on the run from Saul. That's where David learned it. He didn't learn it while he was living in the palace. He learned it by going through the hard times, by going through adversity. That's where adversity and suffering benefit us. So then, how do we handle it? So because suffering's going to happen. You might, listening to this right now, you might be going through a time of suffering, or you might be about to go into a time of suffering. How do you handle it? And the real question is, how was Christ able to handle and deal with all of the storms and crises and the suffering and all of the evilness that surrounded him? How was he able to deal with it with so much calm and so much peace and so much poise? Now, the answer that a lot of people will say, well, he was God in the flesh, and that's true, but that's not why, because not only was he God in flesh, but he was also man. He was 100% human being. He was, as the Bible tells us, he was tempted in all ways just as we are. In other words, I'm sure there were times that Jesus would get upset and he'd probably want to uncreate people. But what kept him from doing that? How was it that he was able to deal with all of those storms? I think the answer is found in the book of Luke, chapter 22. This happened the night that Jesus was betrayed. They had just had leading into verse 39, they had just observed the Passover celebration in the upper room. Judas had been dismissed because he was the betrayer and he had to go out and betray Jesus. And beginning there in verse 39, it says, "And he came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. And when he came to the place, he said to them, 'Pray that you may not enter into temptation.' And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and knelt down and prayed, saying, 'Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done.' And there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground." So you have this moment, this snapshot at the end of the ministry of Jesus. The next morning, Jesus would be crucified. Probably within the next 12 hours from the moment that this happened. But I want you to see this. What Jesus, first of all, tells the disciples. He says, "You stay here and pray." Why? So that you don't fall into temptation. In other words, Jesus is saying, temptation, hardship, a challenge is about to come your way. So you need to prepare for it right now. Pray. And then Jesus goes and he does the exact same thing because he knows that he's going to be suffering. He knows that he's going to be going through these phony trials and that he's going to be tortured and then crucified. He knows that that's going to happen, and so he prays for the strength to endure it. And he is in such agony and such focus that says great drops of blood were falling down. His sweat, he literally, if you want to know what happened, is the smaller capillaries within his circulatory system. The focus and the intensity probably was so great that some of those burst and entered into his sweat glands, and it was blood mixed with sweat that came out. But you might not have caught the real key here. And it's back there in verse 39. When it says, "And he came and went out." In other words, he left the upper room and went to the garden. And it's the next statement that's so important. "As was his custom." See, for Jesus, the hardest part was never the suffering, but the prayer life and preparation for it. Jesus always knew that the suffering was going to come. He always knew that the adversity was going to occur. He always knew that the challenges were going to arise. And so you'll find this throughout the life of Jesus when you really go in and start studying it, that Jesus time and time again would try and get away from people so that he could spend time alone in prayer, in preparation. That was where the challenge was for Jesus. And it's understandable because if you think about it from this perspective, you had all of these people coming and constantly demanding from Jesus, "Heal me, do this, do that," and people constantly wanting to be around him. He became a very, very big, huge figure within Galilee and Judea. And people were constantly thronging him. And for him to be able to find the time to get close to the Lord and to bring his will into alignment with the Father's and to make sure that they were perfectly in line with one another. That was a challenge. That was difficult. But what this tells us is very important. We must learn to prepare for suffering, not simply react to it. We are very reactionary in our lives. We tend, in how we live, we wait until something happens and then we do something and then we act. But Jesus didn't do that. Jesus prepared and prepared and prepared and prepared, knowing that the suffering was going to come. See, in your life right now, you're in one of three places. You are either in the middle of a time of suffering, you just came out of a time of suffering, or you're about to go into a time of suffering. And if we live reactionary, if we wait until those times come, because we know that they're going to come, for any one of the reasons that we talked about, we know that suffering is going to come. Because we live in an imperfect world, because we're going to do something stupid, because someone is going to do something evil that impacts our lives, or because God is going to do something, take action to cause, to fulfill a purpose. We are going to face some kind of suffering. And if we choose to live reactionary to that, in other words, say, well, I'll just wait until it happens and then I'll deal with it, rather than preparing for it, if we're reactionary to the storms, we'll be sunk. If you prepare for the storm, you survive. In the last lesson, we looked a little bit at the first part of the story of Joseph. But if you fast forward a few decades from the time that Joseph is beaten up by his brothers and sold into slavery, and you see when Joseph is reunited with his family, and his brothers are concerned that now that Joseph's become a very powerful individual, that he's going to get even with them. But here's what Joseph said to his brothers, who were afraid that he was going to get his revenge. Joseph said this, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." In other words, Joseph said, you may have had evil intentions, but God took what you did and he turned it into something good. Because suffering and hardships and sorrow and adversity, they are just some of the tools that God has at his disposal to grow you and to make you into something far, far more than what you are today. To make you more and more like Jesus Christ. And that is what he is doing. And through that, he will receive honor and glory. And it just may be that because of what you go through, that he can use that experience to touch the hearts and lives of other people. Because suffering can have a purpose and does have a purpose. You may not be able to see it while going through it, but God can use it to do something great.